We're pleased to have Caroline Ashcroft joining us today. Caroline studied social and political sciences at Clare College, Cambridge, before taking the MA in the history of political thought at Queen Mary. Caroline then went back to Cambridge and completed a PhD there at the Department of Politics and International Studies. Caroline's PhD was on the political thought of Hannah Arendt, and I'm pleased to say that, well, Caroline, your book, I believe, is going to be out in April, Violence and Power in the Thought of Hannah Arendt, to be published with the University of Pennsylvania Press. But now Caroline is going to be presenting to us on the focus of her Leverhulme project, Technological Determinism in Cold War Political Thought. And the paper you'll be presenting today is specifically the Discourse on Technology in Cold War Political Thought, Media, Modernity and Freedom. I hope I've got that right. Just a few words on the format of the seminar. Caroline will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. We'll then break for 5 minutes to give Caroline and ourselves a breather and maybe follow Adela's example and have a drink. Sorry, Adela. And we'll have time for questions. The session will close around 6:30 p.m, though we sometimes do run over by a few minutes in order to give enough time for questions. Without further ado, Caroline, please go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yep, that's fine. Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be presenting tonight, not least because this is actually for a combination of reasons, the first opportunity I've had to really present from my new project. So I'm looking forward to seeing what sorts of questions and what kind of feedback you have. Yeah, okay, so I will get on with it. So the question of technology's relation to politics was central and even foundational to the work of many influential political thinkers writing in the early decades of the Cold War. This paper will explore the work of 4 of those thinkers and their overlapping critiques of technology. So Frankfurt School philosophers Adorno and Horkheimer, the French sociologist Jacques Ellul, and the political theorist Hannah Arendt, foregrounding their analyses of the impact of contemporary media technologies on modern politics. Their critiques of technology, this paper argues, mediated their thinking about political modernity in important ways. Their understanding of technology is pivotal to how they conceptualize the world in which we live. Technology literally shapes our material world. So thinking about technology specifically helps us to more closely examine certain qualities of modernity in the work of these theorists, I will suggest. And importantly, thinking in terms of technology is revealing of the significant ways in which these thinkers, in which the ideas of these thinkers converge, despite the often fundamental differences in their politics or their philosophical premises. So the centrality of technology in these theorists' work has been recognized to different degrees. For Adorno and Horkheimer, of course, it is a central and much discussed component of their work. For Arendt, it has tended to be seen as more peripheral. For Ellul, who is now of course much less prominent than these other 3 theorists, but was once considered one of the world's foremost critics of technological development, technology is the key axis on which his understanding of modernity turns. While the individuals in this little group possess some, as I've already mentioned, radically different perspectives on the political world, this paper makes the case that these thinkers are part of a shared and indeed much wider Cold War discourse connecting technology with politics, comprising an idea and a critique of technology that is an integral part of the political understanding of these thinkers. And in particular, they share an understanding of a problematic dynamic in how modern technology makes the world. Technology is no longer comparable to tools wielded by individuals in the pursuit of some particular end, but Rather, it has become a process by which modern politics and modern society is continuously being shaped, and now and increasingly beyond the capacity of humanity to control. So at this point, I should say this paper will therefore emphasize the shared connections between these thinkers oriented around that conceptualization of technology. And this, of course, should not be taken to mean that the very substantial differences that exist between these four theorists are unimportant, merely that given the constraints of the paper, it's not really possible to discuss these differences at length here. But with that caveat in mind, the key claim of this paper will be that a substantially coherent characterization of technology can be discerned in these thinkers as a kind of overlapping set of conceptualizations. And as a historical theme which connects some of the 20th century's most important political theorists, this has been, I think, remarkably understudied to date. And even where it has been, the extent of these shared ideas hasn't necessarily been recognized, and nor the pivotal role it plays in the thought of many theorists. Pivotal in the sense that their understanding of politics in modernity is often filtered through technology as they see it. The extensive structural similarities between critiques of technology, which can be found in such highly ideologically diverse political theorists, also suggests that we ought to look beyond the unique philosophy of each thinker to understand their ideas as part of a broader critique or discourse, which is the term that I tend to use, on technological modernity. So their particular ideas of technology, that is, do not independently grow out of specific ideological premises, but also draw substantially on a set of wider discussions about technology that possess a certain level of conceptual clarity. These four thinkers are not straightforwardly connected to one another by any means. Adorno and Horkheimer, of course, work together, and they and Arendt were mutually aware of one another's work, while also being highly critical of it. Ellul's success in America did not come until his work was translated into English in the 1960s, and there is little evidence that he drew directly on Adorno, Horkheimer, or Arendt, or vice versa. So these theorists are not directly in conversation, are not all directly in conversation, but there are several factors that I think help to explain their shared concerns about contemporary technology, and I'll just briefly highlight three here. So first, there were certain shared intellectual influences, of course. All of these thinkers were influenced by a pre-war German tradition of thinking about technology, which, although complex, tended to view technology and more broadly rationalization as an increasingly dominating and transformational force in modern society. Second, these four individuals were profoundly affected by the events of the 1930s and 1940s in Europe, and their experiences, whether of exile or of resistance, which was the case for Ellul, clearly provoked an idea that there was something rotten in contemporary Western civilization. That catastrophe and even apocalypse was now to be expected in the future of the West is the subtext of their thinking. And thirdly, while there was little direct influence between these thinkers, there is a developing critique of technology emerging amongst particularly, but not exclusively, German thinkers in this period, possessing a striking similarity to those outlined here. So the work of, for example, Heidegger, particularly in the 1950s, Hans Jonas, Günther Anders, many thinkers associated with the Frankfurt School, particularly Marcuse, the American writer Lewis Mumford, and a little later, to some extent, Habermas and Foucault, amongst others. So between these thinkers, a fairly cohesive idea and critique of technology emerges, similar to that is evident in the work of Arendt, Ellul, Adorno, and Horkheimer. So a simple line of influence can't be traced, but there are multiple connections and influences within and between this group, out of which this particular concept of technology emerges. So this is kind of the wider story that my project seeks to tell. In this paper, I am going to focus on the relationship that these theorists outline between contemporary freedom, and especially the apparent freedom of democratic politics, and technologies of communication and media, because this is an important component of modernity for them, but also because it exemplifies the way that technology as such is important to their thinking. That is, it shows how, whilst their individual critiques of modern political freedom or its absence are clearly distinct and rely upon distinct notions of what authentic freedom is, they also depend upon a shared and rather fatalistic notion of technology. And in particular, this paper will center two particular facets of new media technologies. So first of all, the technologies which enable contemporary propaganda, and secondly, technologies which result in the reforming of the public and private realms and the border between those realms, to show how these theorists conceptualize technology as a key political concern. So I'll begin by outlining the way that these thinkers define modern technology. I'll be treating Adorno and Horkheimer together, given the centrality of their co-authored work, Dialectic of Enlightenment, in their work on technology, as well as the work that each produced around that period in the 1940s. For Arendt, her 1958, The Human Condition is the central text that deals with technology. Although it's a theme in her work really right from the start, from when she's writing The Origins of Totalitarianism in the late 1940s. And for Ellul, The Technological Society, which was first published in 1954, is probably the key text, but the ideas that he developed here are important to his later work as well. So technology is treated by these four not just as a collection of technologies, but as a cohesive concept, as a particular kind of thing in itself. In Arendt, Ellul, Adorno, and Horkheimer, this concept shares certain characteristics, amongst which are alienation, the dehumanizing quality of the machine, totalization, and its mythical or irrational nature. This shared conceptualization underlies their analysis of specific instances of technology in contemporary life. And it means that technology takes on, they argue, or they imply, basically the same traits wherever it is found and in whatever kind of political system. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these characteristics. So technology and modernity is alienating. It alienates because, unlike earlier tools, which simply mediated human relationships with things or other people, technology divides humans from objects and from persons, and ultimately from themselves, offering technological replacements. We can see this in Adorno and Horkheimer's claim that technology divides the individual from themselves and from genuine social relations, and that today's ideal human or laborer is modeled upon technological ideals. Technology today is, Adorno and Horkheimer argue, quote, coercive society alienated from itself, end quote. But it masks this through, for example, television, which Adorno wrote obscures the real alienation between people and things because it becomes a substitute for social immediacy. For Ellul, the increasing dominance of technological mediation between us and our world has led to the replacement of that world by technology. The social or individual consciousness today is formed directly by the presence of technology, he writes. They've come to make up a new universe, the technological environment. For Arendt, the problem is that we are alienated from our condition in the world. Modern humanity is characterized by a condition of what she refers to as earth alienation, that we today think of ourselves in universal terms as creatures of the universe, not the earth, and is directly attributed by her to the development of modern science and technology. Technology is also dehumanizing. Adorno and Horkheimer, Arendt and Ellul all differ on what the specifically human quality of mankind is, but they agree that technology undermines our humanity, as their critiques of alienation suggest. In the modern world, humans are made to fit to the machine rather than vice versa, they claim. The machine becomes the model for human existence. The result is that the logic of technology supplants the ways in which we formerly made sense of human action, and it undermines the dialectic of ends and means. Arendt argues that the replacement of individual action by the automated process of machinery degrades the distinction between means and ends. Today, quote, even the most general end, the release of manpower that was usually assigned to machines, is now thought to be a secondary and obsolete aim, inadequate to and limiting potential startling increases in efficiency, end quote. Adorno concurs that individuals are becoming increasingly dehumanized, arguing that when thinking subjects passionately transform themselves into the instruments of such formalization, then they virtually cease being subjects. They approach the machine in the guise of its imperfect replica. And Horkheimer reveals almost identical claims in the Critique of Instrumental Reason. Ellul too emphatically proclaims the inhumanity of the machine's technique that has, quote, created an inhuman atmosphere. Technology is also totalizing, and for these thinkers, the emergence of totalitarian politics and modern technology is intertwined. Thus, technique, writes Ellul, causes the state to become totalitarian, to absorb the citizen's life completely. This is the same in democracies as dictatorships, he insists. That is, it is technique itself, the totalizing tendency of technology, that causes domination. Arendt explains the totalizing quality of modern technology as a literally universalizing tendency. The invention of the telescope, which is the foundational modern technology for Arendt, precipitated a mode of technological understanding which sought to encompass the whole of nature, the universe as well as our earthly domain. And Adorno and Horkheimer explicitly suggest that the urge to unity in technology pushes societies towards totalitarianism. Every forward step of science, and especially of technology, is also an act of integration, they write. Finally, we turn to the concept of myth. Famously, in The Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer argue that although the Enlightenment has been considered the dissolution of myth by reason, the reality is that, quote, enlightenment with every step becomes more deeply engulfed in mythology, end quote. While mythologization is not a product of modernity, but rather a perpetual feature of Western societies, its modern form emerges through technology. Baconian instrumental rationality, which Adorno and Horkheimer identify at the root of modern enlightenment, is in truth the rationale of domination, and technology is the essence of this knowledge. Knowledge is power, and the precise mode of this domination is the myth of modernity. Like Adorno and Horkheimer, Ellul identifies the myth of science with the development of the Enlightenment. Modernity reverts to myth. Although Ellul is much more receptive to the ideal of Enlightenment reason, he identifies its historical decline from reason to rationality, then rationalism and myth. Rationality's aim was to subject everything to reason, he writes, to absorb everything into a rational framework. But the absolutism of rationality was accompanied by an even worse perversion, rationalism. And with rationalism, we pass over into the universe of gods and myths. In a notable contrast, Arendt does not widely adopt the language of myth in her work, but she does believe that the human capacity to think has been degraded, which has resulted in ideological thinking. Modern reason has certainly not empowered this human capacity. So for these four theorists, these various aspects describe, in parts, the nature of technology in modernity. That is, technology itself is characterized in this way, and the various technologies which emerge out of technological modernity further extend this into our lives. The rest of this paper will focus on some more specific examples of contemporary technologies and the concerns that these thinkers share about modern media and communications technologies. Although, of course, it's important to note that these are not the only kind of technologies these thinkers worry about by any means. So I'll begin by the way that they understand such technologies to be problematically shaping the relationship between public and private. Adorno, Horkheimer, Arendt, and Enoll are all concerned with how media technologies have enabled structures of domination and closed down opportunities for opposition and differentiation. Broadly, we see in each of these philosophers' work a concern about the movement from earlier, more differentiated or fragmented spheres of action towards a totalizing space of political domination in the contemporary world. The changing shape of these spaces of action and the changes in the boundaries or connections between the public and private is not wholly the result of technological progress, but technology is now arguably the single biggest influence on its development. And importantly, they share the view that there is little space left for freedom in such a world. The nature of the public-private relationship is, of course, pivotal to Arendt's work. She insists we must comprehend the conceptual distinction between public and private to uphold or to establish spaces for political action. The private and the public worlds operate according to completely different modes of action, and thus clear boundaries between these realms are essential. It is only in her somewhat idealized public political realm that action, the unique spontaneity of human beings acting into the world and thus realizing their freedom, can be guaranteed in any way, because only in the public world can individuals be recognized as distinct but equal, and thus be equally capable of acting into the world without domination. Yet increasingly, she argues, the distinction between the two spheres that protects the integrity of both has been degraded, merged into what she calls the social sphere, where the public is increasingly overwhelmed by a private sphere that has spilled over its traditional boundaries. Yet this is to somewhat oversimplify Arendt's argument here. It is not simply the case that as the private sphere expands, the public space shrinks. Both have evolved from their original forms. The private sphere evolved from the classical household into what she refers to as a sphere of intimacy unknown to any period prior to the modern age. Even more recently, totalitarian tendencies have placed that version of the private realm under threat just as much as the public. Both public and private are under attack today, Arendt believes, because of the erasing of the traditional conceptual boundary between the two with the rise of the social, which, quote, today constitutes the public organization of the life process itself. The long history of the degradation of the public-private distinction is not due or does not originate in the rise of modern technology. The origins of its collapse predate contemporary technology in Arendt's story, but the shape that this relationship now takes is increasingly bound up with the nature of technology. So Arendt's 1960 essay, The Crisis in Culture, summarizes her critique of the way that public and private merge in modernity with reference to the technologies of mass entertainment. She argues that mass culture, modern culture, relies utterly upon modern technology, and that the culture of modern societies is now therefore determined by the nature and the logic of those technologies. Mass society, she writes, wants not culture but entertainment, consumed by society just like any other consumer goods. The goods produced by the culture industry are mere, quote, consumer goods destined to be used up, rather than cultural, worldly objects of permanence. This mass culture is neither public, because it is consumerist, it is ephemeral and driven by process, nor is it truly private, in the sense that it provides a space for intimacy or difference, because it has this mass standardized quality. Technology, she suggests, is destroying the very architecture of our world, breaking apart the remnants of the public sphere, but also of the private as a space of difference and intimacy. Jacques Ellul's views on the public and private are in accord with Arendt. So he agrees that the private sphere is being eroded, But he identifies the culprit as the state rather than the society or the social, and behind the state, technique or technology. The modern state controls both public and private life, undermining what Ellul considers to be a critically important dialectical tension between the two spheres. In modernity, everything, he argues, has been politicized. That is, politics extends into even the most private spaces of life. Only conflict between public and private and the return of a private sphere can restore true reality, he argues, against the totalizing force of politics. This is a very different argument to Arendt's in many ways, of course, but like Arendt, Ellul argues that a major problem with modernity is that the prior dynamic between public and private has disappeared to be replaced by a kind of amorphous totality. For Ellul, the erosion of the private sphere can be directly attributed to recent expansions in technology. So he highlights the influence of radio and television, which, quote, inserts the individual in the psychological and behavioral structure of the mass. The extension of technology into private life makes it increasingly political, and it makes the political increasingly totalitarian as it moves to absorb the citizen's life completely. What remains of private life, he writes, must be forced into line by invisible techniques. All must be compelled towards a new integration. Turning to Adorno and Horkheimer's work, we find similar claims on the merging of the public and private, generally to the detriment of privacy. In The Dialectic of Enlightenment, they write of how monopolizing unitary culture turns all life into public life. Horkheimer writes of the way that technologies such as photography, telegraphy, and the radio transform how we experience private and public events. These technologies shrink the world, enabling us, in his words, to witness the misery of the entire earth. What was remote has become part of our world, and, quote, simultaneously, what is close has become the far away. Now the horror of one's own city is submerged in the general suffering, while people turn their attention to the marital problems of movie stars. Perhaps the most powerful technology in this transformation of culture, which attacks the private, is television, which, Adorno writes, plugs the gap between private existence and the mass culture industry. Adorno and Horkheimer do not attribute particular importance to the public as a distinctly political realm. The public appears really as an outgrowth of capitalist domination. Despite this, there is good reason to pay attention to the changing dynamic of the relationship between public and private in their work, which is that they consider the opposition of public to private, an opposition which has largely disappeared today, to possess importance. Publicness or society is, of course, part of our world, but historically it was not inevitable that the individual would necessarily bow to society. Once the opposition of the individual to society was its substance, they write, it glorified the bravery and freedom of the emotion before a powerful enemy and inflicted an exalted affliction, a dreadful problem. Today, tragedy has melted away into the nothingness of that false identity of society and individual, end quote. The individual as private person is erased in modernity because the mass culture industry has engulfed the space for privacy. And yet, like Arendt, Adorno and Horkheimer indicate that modernity is also characterized by a new type of privacy. Quote, absolute solitude, the violent turning inward on the self, whose whole being consists in the mastery of material and in the monotonous rhythm of work. This kind of privacy divides individuals from any authentic community. Their organization is as commodities, not as human beings. Technology is the means by which this takes place. These theorists attach different valuations to the public and the private. Yet their ideas about the relationship between public and private do intersect in significant respects. And in particular, although their ideas of the public are quite different, they are much more closely aligned in their critique of the modern private sphere. They agree that modern society does not permit that which is previously part of human life, a space in which people can exist meaningfully outside the public or political sphere. And all believe that the tension between the private and the public is important for holding open a space for freedom. For Arendt, largely because the public sphere cannot withstand the force of the interests at play in the private sphere. For Ellul, because only the tension between public and private can limit the modern state. And for Adorno and Horkheimer, because only in the private sphere can individuals understand themselves as distinct from the systems that govern the world today. For all, an opposition between these two spheres of action is necessary for the realization of freedom, and their collapse into one totality totally undermines its possibility. Against the erosion of the public-private distinction, which is, we might say, a largely unintended collapse of the spaces in which freedom can be realized, propaganda is the intentional, active utilization of technologies for the purposes of total control. Both mark shifts towards the totalization of society. And for Arendt, Ellul, Adorno, and Horkheimer, the rise of propaganda, a specifically 20th century phenomena, because it relies upon the emergence of modern communications technologies, is a key characteristic of modernity. Propaganda is a particular technique, but it is also something that can only occur via the use of modern technologies, because propaganda is inherently mass communication. Propaganda helps to create and then utilize mass society. Thus, Ellul claims that radio listeners have been found to exhibit a mass mentality. Arendt highlights that propaganda is not simply a means utilized by totalitarian politics, but is an integral quality of modern political communication. She writes, not only political propaganda, but the whole of modern mass publicity contains an element of threat. And Horkheimer argues that the development of the mass media of propaganda, such as newspapers, radio, television polls, and their connection and interplay with the decline in education, must necessarily lead to dictatorship and the regression of humanity. Not only are technology and propaganda intimately connected, these theorists argue that the instruments of media technologies are inherently propagandistic. Propaganda derives from the overarching logic of modern technology. Modern media technologies are, writes Adorno and Horkheimer, essentially instruments of standardization. Radio, for example, turns all participants into listeners and authoritatively subjects them to broadcast programs which are all exactly the same. Propaganda, Ellul agrees, is not just a weapon, but the effect of a technological society that embraces the entire man and tends to a completely integrated society. Technology is now intrinsically propagandistic because it mediates how individuals understand the world. Technology is behind the emergence and dominance of scientific reason, these writers suggest, and not vice versa. Adorno and Horkheimer, as we have seen, trace today's scientific attitude to Bacon's thoughts, asserting that technology is the essence of this knowledge, and specifically the methods enabling exploitation or domination. Arendt highlights the importance of technological event on the development of scientific thinking. It was the event of Galileo turning his telescope skyward that stimulated the rise of modern scientific thought and ultimately modern reason, she argues. Yet the rationality that ultimately emerged was a, quote, a sort of brain power in which more than one respect resembles nothing so much as the labor power the human animal develops in its metabolism with nature. This is a form of thinking, in other words, which models the same kind of brute force that labor enacts upon nature. What Ellul terms modernity's rationalism, a form of knowledge corresponding to modern technology's character, an increasingly illiberal set of doctrines that seeks to impose itself upon the world, is a corruption of Enlightenment reason. And although it depends upon the development of scientific thinking, is itself reliant upon technology. Where the technical means do not exist, he writes, science does not advance. This all has the effect of constructing a self-realization of the individual as part of a mass, a crucial enabler of propaganda. The proclaimed universality of reason claims dominance over individual thoughts or experiences. It causes the deterioration of independent thought and tends to produce masses who act as undifferentiated crowds, as well as justifying treating people as masses to be managed. What convinces masses, Arendt explains, is the consistency of the system of which they are presumably part. And this is what gives propaganda such power in mass society, but also indicates the underlying power of the technology system or process itself. Thus, the emergence of a type of scientific rationality in modernity, in large part due to modern technology, creates conditions that are ripe for propaganda, that bring about the demand for technologization by the people themselves, and with it, an openness to propaganda. The audience for propaganda has been prepared by technological processes, which have played an important role in creating so-called mass man, and which have developed the means by which propaganda is enabled. The result, all four thinkers agree, is that modern media is essentially propagandistic, whilst the mass not only accepts but demands propaganda. Their analyses of propaganda, of course, it should be said, go beyond this. We cannot simply equate propaganda to technology. However, we certainly cannot understand it without reference to the processes they believe characterize contemporary technology. Technology does not wholly determine politics, even for these four technological skeptics, because they accept that there may potentially still be a way out. But because technology is so deeply enmeshed in politics in the 20th century, it largely directs political possibility and it severely restricts freedom. Our age presents a politics which is uniquely unfree, these thinkers agree, in large part because the cumulative effects of technology mean we are losing the very capacity to distinguish between freedom and domination. Technology shapes the material and ideological spaces of our political world in problematic ways because it objectifies and fixes the coercive element of human society in its structures and processes. Adorno and Horkheimer writes that technology is domination reified or objectified, and that it aims to total domination, excluding the possibility for critical thinking that is a prerequisite for meaningful freedom. Ellul also emphasizes the importance of the dialectic and the way that the relentless objectification of the world by technology destroys the possibilities for freedom. The modern state integrates all persons into the mass, leaving only the illusion of freedom, he argues. And unless freedom achieves victory over such a technology, he suggests, freedom is completely without meaning. In Arendt's work, objectification has a wholly authentic political function, understood as the acts of work that produce the structures of the stable human world. Artworks, buildings, texts, institutions, even legislation or poetry fall within the scope of worldliness. But the modern world has corrupted this kind of activity, she argues, and work is now considered exclusively as part of the act of laboring. That is, the all-consuming natural processes whereby humans produce only consumption objects. We have confused these domains with their distinct functions, and the objectification that takes place through technological automation is the attempted objectification of processes, not the fabrication of particular worldly objects. Technological processes are essentially labor processes for her. They seek to set up the necessity of natural labor processes as the basis of politics, and thereby also excluding freedom from politics. So technological modernity enacts the wrong kind of objectification. What freedom is would, of course, be fiercely disputed amongst these philosophers. Yet their pessimism about its status in modernity is shared. In part, this can be attributed to the profoundly important experience of totalitarianism and their reflections on that phenomenon that connects them all. However, their shared critique of technology sharpens this pessimism into a more specific form. where totalitarian politics and technological processes together become predominant forces, at times even melding into one another. They disagree on what freedom is, in other words, but they are agreed on the means by which freedom is being destroyed. The discourse regarding technology that has been outlined in this paper, therefore, is connected by a shared responsiveness to the threat of totalitarianism, but also by elements of shared methodology, certainly as regards the rejection of the ideal or idea in political philosophy, in favor of an active and material understanding of the political world or space. It has been argued that the problematic of technology identified by such thinkers as those discussed here simply reduces modernity to an inadequately narrow understanding of an era dominated by technology, science, and bureaucracy. And it may well be argued that the role of technology objectively takes on too much importance in these thinkers' work. But nonetheless, this is a perspective which is shared by a significant number of serious and influential theorists of this period, and so should be, I think, recognized as such. And although this narrative clearly builds upon German traditions or influences, it is by no means exclusive to German thinkers. So this shared narrative, to conclude, or shared conceptualization of technology and its relationship to freedom, constitutes an important intellectual thread in the history of Cold War era political thought, I would argue. For each of these thinkers, technology perverts not only modernity, but also what they believe might enable humans to escape their current condition, that is, a positive tension or dialectic between different spaces or modes of activity. For Ellul, technology is a modern religion or irreligion, corrupting true spirituality by enforcing its singular ideology upon man. For Arendt, technology attacks the fragile public intercourse of free human beings, destroying the possibility of creating a political space for action. For Adorno and Horkheimer, technology seeks to repress critique itself, and thus the possibility of progress. Exploring the concept of technology thus reveals often unseen connections between these different thinkers. And by looking at this concept, the importance of the material world in their comprehension of modern politics is highlighted, as well as is the way in which technology constructs and restricts individuals, modern individuals, to a particular world in which freedom is radically limited. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, for a fascinating paper. We'll now break for 5 minutes just to give our speaker a breather and to digest what's been said. So if you could return to your screens, as bleak as that sounds, by 5 minutes past 6, that would be great. Thank you. And feel free to turn your cameras and mics on now if you want to chat. So, Caroline, is this a chapter from a book project? Is that where the Leave Hume's heading?
Yeah, so it's well, it is a chapter from the book along with a little bit of the sort of overarching arguments of the book to try and give it a bit more context. So I realize as I'm reading through it how much is in there. Anyway, we can talk about that, I'm sure.
I haven't roped you into a discussion before the 5 minutes.
No, that's absolutely fine. But yeah, it's a chapter from, or a version of a chapter from the book.
Right. Great. All right, I'll leave you. I'll leave you be for a few minutes. Caroline did assure us that she's not developing COVID as we watch her speak. Common or garden cold?
No, I've been tested. My son started nursery recently, so I strongly suspect that's where the cold has come from. And I'm sure there's many more in the near future as well.
Okay, we're just coming up to 5 minutes past. I'll open the queue for questions. So you can either use the raise hand function in Zoom or just type in the chat box and I'll add you to the queue of questioners. So who would like to ask the first question? Adela, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I couldn't find the raise your hand function for some reason, so I raised it physically. Thanks for noticing. That was great. That was one I really enjoyed this paper, and I've got lots of I'm still sort of processing some of the ideas. But one of the first things that I wanted to ask Caroline is whether any of these thinkers actually sort of develop a vision of what then should be done about this problem of rising technology and its impact on political life and personal experience as well. So do they imagine that sort of the progress of technology must be stopped, or that there needs to be some sort of a reshaping of our relationship with it? So, sort of what directions do they take this critique in? Thanks.
Thank you. Interesting question, and it's a rather pessimistic or negative answer, I'm afraid. they're all pretty skeptical about where we're going, where technology is taking us. I think one of the interesting and probably, well, problematic aspects of their thinking about technology is that it is so deterministic, right? So technology is taking us down this highly, highly problematic path. You know, for Adorno and Horkheimer in Dialectic of Enlightenment, you know, that's very, very widely recognized as sort of, you know, there's no way out. How do we, but I think that this is true more generally of the thinkers that I'm looking at in this project. So there isn't really a vision of what should be done. For some, that's not strictly speaking true of everyone. So Mark Hughes is somebody that I'm interested in looking at, and of course he's much more optimistic, particularly in the late 1960s, about the possibility for revolution and the overcoming of technology, and even the utilizing technology potentially in new ways, but that has to be within a new society. And I think that that's probably the best that you could say for all of these thinkers, is that their vision of a positive future, insofar as technology is shaping society and shaping politics, it would seem that there would have to be a revolution for that to take place, right? The technology, and what I mean by that is technology is so bound up with, or what technology is today is so bound up with contemporary politics and society and its institutions and structures. You have to transform the whole thing in order to get rid of technology. Now there's one kind of, I guess, possibly more optimistic caveat to that, which is that the idea of technology that they're referring to is something that is specific to modernity. So it's intertwined with modern politics and modern society. It's not necessarily technology, you know, this is something that has emerged. It's something that has developed. It's something specific to our time. There's nothing in the, you know, in technology as tools in itself that will necessarily lead to this. So it's perfectly feasible to envisage a society and a politics where a different kind of or technology is used in different ways, or, you know, that could be much more authentic, sort of authentically political or open to freedom. But it would need sort of radical change. And because our idea of technology is so restricted by the historical development of technology and what technology, the role that technology plays in society today, you know, it's hard to see really what that would be. So there's sort of a little chink of light there, but it's really not very much.
Max.
Thank you, Wasim, and thank you so much, Caroline, for a wonderful paper. I was wondering about the technology of weaponry and technological changes in warfare, which is something I think that Arendt is particularly interested in, how nuclear weapons, effectively, weapons of mass destruction, change the way we relate to power, or it enables rulers to rule by force in a way that wasn't possible before. So I was wondering, how much is that a factor in the discussion? And secondly, if I may, just one small thing, which is related to what you and Wasim talked about in the break, but in relation where you're going with this after. So just out of interest, how much of this feeds into Habermas and that critique you have of mass culture, mass society, because it seems like, of course, via Adorno Horkheimer, it's going to be a lot of continuity. But I was wondering if that's somewhere you're heading. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you. So on the question of weapons, like it's the paper that I've just presented is a version of a chapter of the eventual book, I hope. There will also be a chapter on weapons, and emergence of total warfare, and even more importantly, the development and the use of nuclear bomb is totally foundational to this idea of technology. Well, let me change that slightly. It's not foundational in that it is not the case that Hiroshima happened and they suddenly decided that technology was the enemy, right? Of course, these ideas predate that in many of these thinkers individually, and in the influences that they're drawing on, particularly in sort of 1920s and 1930s Germany. But it is a culmination, I suppose, of the events of the Second World War, of the Holocaust, of the way that technology was utilized in new and terrifying ways. So nuclear bomb encapsulates that. And it's certainly something that all of these thinkers frequently refer back to. So yeah, that's, I would say, sort of roughly speaking, the sort of role that I see weapons, and especially nuclear weapons, playing here. I would just say, though, that one of the things that I sort of want to do with the project is whilst recognizing the importance of that aspect of it to their thoughts, to the idea, the construction of this idea of technology, is to sort of take it beyond that. So hence the project will look at, as I have done today, media and communications technologies. It will look at, obviously, production technologies and automation in work and those sorts of things, and different aspects of technology. So it's a much more, I think the idea of technology is much more rounded in terms of what it's looking at than just weapons. On Habermas, yeah, Habermas is really interesting. The problem with this project is it has a tendency to, well, I guess like most projects, has a tendency to expand. And Habermas is certainly someone who is of interest, but I think will be, well, he is, I would say, peripheral to the sort of discourse on technology that I'm talking about. Mainly because he just doesn't fit into, his notion of technology just doesn't quite fit the one that I've laid out today. That is, he is not deterministic about the character of technology in the way that these other thinkers, I think I would say, are. And of course, he's nowhere near as pessimistic as these others are. And I think that's one of the most important things, right? The idea of technology, the discourse of technology that I am describing, is one of catastrophe or apocalypse. And that isn't what Habermas is doing. So there's lots of overlap there. And I certainly see him as somebody who will necessarily be treated in some way in the book. I don't see him as one of the central figures here, though.
Will Salinger.
Thank you for the very interesting paper, Caroline. I guess your paper is really about finding this similar theme across these different authors. And I guess I kind of want to maybe press you on one particular difference. And just curious what you would say. It strikes me that in certain ways, I think one thing about Arendt that's a bit distinctive is that I'm not sure that technology is a sort of single narrative encompassing ideas and politics all as kind of one story, right? So she certainly thinks, I think, as you say, that technology has had a quite profound impact on modern politics. But she also seems to think that we have another problem, which is that our ideas about politics, even going back well before technology, are kind of wrong-headed, right? And that's a sort of independent problem. And that, the sort of, let's say, emancipatory tradition that comes out of the French Revolution That is also really problematic. The nation state is an extremely problematic political form. And I guess I wonder, like, is that distinct maybe from some of the other authors, that technology is one among many problems? And I can't help but wonder if that's a kind of cause in a weird way for hope, that our problems are so overdetermined. It's not clear that we need to kind of, that, if we could think better about politics in some way for her, wouldn't that sort of be the start of something very important, even leaving the sort of, even perhaps in a world of technology? And I think there might be indications of that in some of her work, and I could say more, but I think you get the picture of what I'm asking.
Yeah, so let's see. There's lots to think about there. So the first thing that I would say in response to that is that I am, of course, trying to, I think reasonably sort of emphasize a dimension of Arendt that hasn't been given, I think, as much attention as it should be. I know Wasim has written on this, of course. There is work that has been done on this, but it isn't typically, her Arendt's work on technology is not typically recognized as central. And I think that is unfair. I think if you look at the introduction to the human condition, she explicitly sets out the fact that this is a work about the condition of humanity, or, about the human condition in the present age, in the technological context, right? So it's absolutely key to the context of what she is doing there. So of course I've kind of highlighted that above other dimensions of her work. The other components of the many other aspects of her work that might be ways out of this, well, either ways out of the sort of binds that we find ourselves in contemporary politics, or indeed the other problems that she identifies historically that have led us here. Well, let me take those separately, actually. In terms of the historical problems, yes, there are many different problems. I would not want to suggest that it is technology that has resulted in, a problematic modernity. There are clearly many things and many different strands that have resulted in that. I would say that today technology for her is certainly one of the most important. It has become and is projected to become perhaps the most important, insofar as you can project, which I think actually all of these thinkers have no issue with doing that, or with supposing they can do that. In terms of these other possibilities of rethinking politics in different ways, as ways out of the problems of contemporary politics. Yes, it's a possibility, but coming back to the answer that I gave Adela, Arendt sort of famously said in an interview that, is there a way, I forget the wording, is there a way out? Is there a space for this politics? And she says, maybe after the next revolution. It's still a sense, there is still a sense there of the modern world being so screwed up on a really fundamental level that actually some kind of revolution is required in order to get there. And whether you think that actually technology is the main thing that needs to be overturned, or whether you think that it's our problematic ideas of technology, whether you think it's the nation state or any other thing, I think that pessimism is still there.
Georgios.
Thanks very much. Caroline, I'm hesitating because there is a queue, so I'll keep it very short. I don't know how far you have gone with the Jacques Ellul part of the project, but a potential influence or source that you may have found already, and if you haven't, you may find in the future is Simone Weil. Your answer to a question by Max earlier about nuclear weapons is already a powerful beginning of an answer why somebody who died in 1943 cannot be part of the project. But as an influence on somebody who has theological interests like Elul, I would suspect there is a lot that you would find in her, in articles, some disturbingly powerful articles she wrote in a periodical called Révolution Prolétarienne in the 1930s, and then also an essay on reflections on the causes of liberty and social oppression. I don't know if you found anything already, but I would recommend looking for that in the future.
Thank you. No, in short, no, I haven't looked at that, but I certainly will. So thank you very much.
Emily.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, I'd just like to propose we run over by 5 minutes, say, till 35 minutes past, if that's okay. So we're not too rushed. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt, Emily. Go ahead.
Thanks, Caroline. That was really interesting. And I think you're right that technology hasn't really been looked at that much in these thinkers. I was wondering though, so I mean, knowing Adorno and Horkheimer best out of the people that you've mentioned, the dialectic of enlightenment is of course like such a, it's such a negative work in many ways. And it obviously also sits quite early at the beginning of this Cold War period, basically before it starts in 1944. And I was wondering whether the context of the Cold War doesn't in some ways force all of these thinkers to also rethink how they think about technology and progress. So with just the political pressures of the Cold War, in Cold War liberalism, the end of ideology debate, the socialist discourse in Germany, for example, also thinks about, well, what can we do? What can we achieve? So is there also, I'm not sure, I'm just wondering what you would think, having looked at a range of thinkers, whether the context of the Cold War as it progresses also changes technology, or whether it's a static interpretation of the concept.
Thank you. So, the context of, let me go back a little bit. This project could be started, you know, at many points. You could very easily go back to the 1920s and 30s in Germany and start the project there. It's not going to be on the discourse on technology as I've sort of set it out here, of course, but certainly the ideas of technology, the influences on how they're conceptualizing technology start there in the early careers of Arendt, of Adorno, Horkheimer, and other thinkers that I'm looking at. Excuse me. Nearly made it through without coughing. One way in which I think the Cold War context is particularly important, and which distinguishes this discourse, this conceptualization of technology from those that come before, is the way in which technology, or understanding modern politics and modern society as intrinsically bound up in technology, or modeled upon technological ideals, is a different way of conceptualizing global politics. It is, I think, often implicitly and sometimes explicitly offered as an alternative to the sort of Cold War dichotomy, right? So we can't simply contrast East and West and opposites, or democracy and communism as opposites. If we think about the world in terms of technology, if we think about the Cold War world in terms of technology, and we think about the political regimes of the world in terms of technology, what we see, according to these thinkers, is that they're all kind of on the same path, right? They're not opposed to one another. They are, modeled. Their politics is modeled on the same problematic ideas, sort of self-destructive, and yeah, you know, freedom is somewhere else entirely, that we can't kind of can't claim that for ourselves, you know, or for the West. So I think I would say that that's one of the most important ways in which this is a specifically Cold War response or understanding of the idea of technology. I'm sure there are many, many other ways as well that you could think about the specific influences and dimensions of Cold War politics as well. But that's something that for me is quite important.
I'm going to read out a question from Rinku Pegu in the chat box. So with regards to media technologies, how would you read or situate social media within the framework posited by these theorists?
Social media, okay, so I'm just going to preface this answer with the fact that I am in no way an expert on modern technology or social media, so this is just some reflections. I think that social media is really social media is totally opposed. It is the opposite of how these thinkers that I talked about today conceptualized media technology, because they see it as broadcast technology. The very problem of the technologies that they're discussing, radio and television especially, is that you have a central authority or body that is broadcasting an idea to a mass. Of course, that is not what social media is at all. It is the very opposite of that. So in that way, there's just a complete divergence. On the other hand, social media companies are indeed monopolies. There is centralization and unification of perhaps a slightly different kind in contemporary media technologies, contemporary social media technologies. And certainly it's not, you know, something that these thinkers certainly not something these thinkers anticipated. But if we are to sort of reflect on the differences or similarities between them, certainly in terms of sort of centralization, you might argue that actually there are more comparisons to be made between social media and the forms of media that they are discussing than we might initially think.
Okay, so, well, we have 1 minute to go, but if you don't mind going over a couple of minutes, I'll take 2 questions. But could we have them in turn so Caroline can answer them together? So that's Alex Eiserman and Charlie Williams. And if you could keep them quite brief, please. Thank you.
All right, I'll try to be brief. So I'm really interested in this distinction between science and technology. I might be wrong, but it seems to me a little interesting that they emphasize technology over science as a means of inquiry, as a means of producing technology. And you got into this a little bit. My question is, to what extent do they perceive there to be a problem with how science asks questions about the world? I think Aram talks a little bit about this in Truth and Politics. Is it that there might be great epistemological success of scientific inquiry, but ultimately the things it's doing are non-political, and that's the problem. So my question is about to what extent do they distinguish between science and technology, and is science as a mode of thinking inherently unpolitical?
Alex, you were cracking up a bit, but Caroline, did you get the sense of the question, which was about the questions posed by science? You're muted, I'm afraid, but I'll take that as a yes. Charlie, do you want to add your question, then Caroline can answer both?
Yeah, actually, I think you kind of answered it with the question that was read out in the chat. I was just thinking of Fred Turner's work. Have you come across that? And just the kind of reimagination in the 60s and 70s of technology as something that's kind of personal, individual. And my other question was way too big for time. I was going to ask you about the 3 conceptions of freedom that you mentioned, but I think that's probably not going to have time for that. Thank you very much for a great paper as well.
Okay, shall I go ahead?
Yes, Caroline, sorry.
So, all right, so I think only half of sort of Alex's question, but the distinction between science and technology, or how important is the distinction between science and technology? It's quite an important, I think it's quite an important part of this project, or it's quite an important claim that I make in this project, is that technology is seen by these theorists as being, in different ways, more, how do I put this? Well, more influential than science in modern life and in modern politics, and even foundational to science. So I think it's fair to say we tend to think of science as science leading technology, or science orienting technology. There is an explicit claim amongst these thinkers, in the work of these thinkers, that is not the case, and that emerges in different ways, as I said. So, for example, in Arendt, it is actually quite a straightforward claim that through the instruments, the invention of scientific technologies, the instruments of technology, science then develops, right? So a fairly simple argument. For Adorno and Horkheimer, it's a little bit more complicated. It seems to be that that science, modern science and modern technology emerge at the same time, right? In a relation, sort of in a relationship with one another from the start. And for Ellul, it is that technology is, and again, this is something that he explicitly says, technology is always immanent in science. Technology is, once you have this kind of science, technology will inevitably emerge from it. Now, of course, you can read the causal relationship in slightly different ways. I don't want to oversimplify it, but yeah, so the distinction between science and technology is important, but one of the really important things, I think, is that we recognize, kind of the importance of technology, as that has always existed in modern science. And when I say modern science, I mean sort of, science since sort of the age of the scientific revolutions. So hopefully that slightly speaks to your question. And then on Fred Turner's work, no, I haven't come across it yet. So I'm afraid I don't have anything to say about that, but I will certainly do some more work. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you, Caroline, very much for a fascinating paper and a really great discussion.